Welcome back to the Collectability Podcast. Today, we are going to celebrate the 2-year anniversary of the Collectability Podcast with a discussion with my colleague and co-founder of Collectability, Tania Edwards. We are going to cover a wide array of topics today around the world of collectability, including the latest news from the world of vintage Patek Philippe, some stories past and present from the world of collectability, and some insight into our opinions on the collecting market just ahead of the May Geneva auctions. So, to get started, hello, Tania.
Well, hello, John. This is a pleasure to actually be sitting doing a podcast with you. It makes a change for both of us who've hosted in the past, but with something that we've talked about since we first began doing podcasts, that we should sit down and talk to each other. And I admit that I was the one that kept postponing it because there were so many more interesting people to talk to. But I'm really pleased that we have this opportunity today.
It is so long overdue, and to be in the same room and have a conversation with you that we could share publicly, I think will be quite interesting. I always wonder if people could hear the conversations that we have about the day-to-day business of collectability. It could be its own reality show as we're chasing watches globally, learning the stories, discussing the history, and then discussing the content at the same time of what we want to teach our listeners, share with our listeners, and how collectability engages with the wider world of Patek Philippe. I think if people heard our conversations, it would make them laugh, it'd make them cry, probably make them laugh more. And they might even learn a thing or two about the crazy watch world, because every day for us is an unfolding drama in the world of Patek Philippe.
Well, that's so true. And hardly a day goes by at the end of it when we look back at what's happened. We don't say, you can't make this up.
That's true.
There's always something that you can't make up.
And that's a good segue to talk about the moment that we first met way back when. And I'd like to hear your version of the first time that our lives intersected.
Well, the general story is that it was when I met you at the Henri watch agency to give you a job. But I remember meeting you a little bit earlier than that, in December 1999, at what has since become a legendary auction, which was the auction of the Graves Supercomplication. And you were working at Sotheby's at the time and very involved with that important auction. And what people don't know, actually, is that I had very recently given birth and was on maternity leave. But this auction was so important that I dragged myself out of my house and went along because Alan Banbury, the curator of the Patek Philippe Museum, had flown over specifically to try and buy the Graves Supercomplication. He was buying it for Philippe Stern, on behalf of Philippe Stern, to put into the museum. And so I accompanied him and the then president of Patek Philippe, Hank Edelman, and we went to Sotheby's, and that's when I met you just before the auction started. There was so much excitement. I just remember there were camera crews. It was craziness because everybody knew that something important was going to happen that day. And we go up to our VIP box, which I believe you had booked for us.
Yes, I remember.
And Alan is obviously bidding, and he's bidding, I'm assuming, with Darren Schnipper. She's on the floor with a phone, and Alan has one phone in his right ear and one phone in his left ear. The right is Darren on the floor bidding for him, and the left is Philippe Stern in Geneva, who is hearing the prices go and deciding whether or not he's going to bid. And once the numbers started rolling and going into the millions, which we knew it would go for millions, but once it hit 8, 9, 10, it was staggering amount of money, because we're used to seeing Pateks going for those kind of crazy numbers today. But this is 20 years ago. That simply wasn't the case. The nearest number would be 3.2 million, which is for the Caliber 89. So this was just unbelievable. And I can remember hearing Philippe Stern go, we, whenever he wanted to put a bid in, and then Alan putting the bid in. And then it got to 10 million, and Philippe Stern goes, non, je finis. Alan, he was overcome with sadness because he wanted to keep going, because he wanted this watch so badly. And I remember him saying, c'est une pièce unique, begging with Philippe Stern to please put another bid in. And Philippe was saying, non, je finis. this was a very interesting lesson for all of us because Philippe Stern is a very experienced bidder at auction. And as with all of these kind of people, he had his limit, and it was 10 million. He didn't know who he was bidding against at the time. None of us knew. But you knew from the way the numbers were going up exponentially that this was someone with a bottomless pocket. And so he has stopped.
And from my perspective, I remember looking up at that moment when Patek Philippe appeared to stop bidding.
Yeah.
And just being in shock.
Yeah, everyone was in shock.
The reality that the Graves Supercomplication was not going back to Patek Philippe was going to happen. Now, I knew who you were bidding against at that time. And of course, from a business perspective, I hoped you'd throw a few more bids up.
Of course, everybody did.
I mean, it was a battle of the Titans, and I have a lot of respect that Philippe Stern knew when to stop, because I think if he went to 15, it would have sold for 16, and it would have just kept going and
it would
going
have kept going
and going.
And it would have been craziness, absolute craziness.
Yes. So I think he had some Swiss restraint
He
and
did.
just knowing how far to take it.
We all know how super smart he is, and that was a very emotional time because Hank and I were going, whoop, whoop, whoopee. This is the, record-breaking figure. And then there's Alan Banbury crushed that he didn't get it. So we couldn't celebrate on one hand and had to commiserate and be sad on the other. It was a very emotional time for sure. So that was the first time I met you. The second time I met you was in my office.
Yes.
And at that time, Hank Edelman, who was the president of Patek, as I mentioned, and I was the vice president, said, please, can you meet this young man who works for Sotheby's? We're very interested in giving him a job as a salesperson. And I was like, sure. And I remember when you came into my office and started talking about Patek, I was just blown away by your passion because, again, we're talking about over 20 years ago, we didn't see people with this kind of passion unless you worked for Patek. And it was just so inspiring. And then that combined with your obvious intelligence and charm made me go to Hank afterwards and say, this guy could run our company. We should give him a job.
And I recall thinking, going into your office, it was on the 14th floor at One Rock, and I was just shocked. It was the most incredible office I've ever seen in New York or anywhere, with this amazing view. And I was wondering, why is Tania's office so much nicer than the president's?
Yes, it was a wonderful corner office overlooking St. Patrick's Cathedral on the right and Rock Centre in the middle. I was very lucky that I had that big office and enjoyed every second being in it.
That seems like yesterday. But how did you first become obsessed with Patek Philippe?
Well, it's quite a funny story and not a traditional one by any means at all. My first introduction to Patek came when I was a teenager at university, and I was probably about 19, I think. And at the time, my boyfriend and I were backpacking around Europe in the summer holidays, and this guy, his father was a Swiss watchmaker, and he decided that we needed to go to Geneva for the sole reason of going into Patek Philippe so that I could understand what the world's finest watchmaker was. Now, let's put this in perspective. I had no knowledge about watches. I had no interest in watches. I could not understand why we had to go and do this. But anyone who's in the industry becomes obsessed with Patek. So off we trot. We're standing outside the magnificent salon, and I said, we can't go in there. Look at how we're dressed. And he said, it's okay, it's Patek. They'll treat you with respect. And we go in, and they did treat me with respect, which I found utterly charming and impressive. And my friend said, please show her the collection, which the salesperson did, and explained Patek to me with great patience. And when I left, I said, one day I'm going to own a Patek. And he said, yes, you will. Little did I know that all these many, many years later, I'm very blessed to own quite a few Pateks and have fallen head over heels in love with the brand. So the relationship with the guy didn't last, but the relationship with Patek did.
That's incredible. And every day we are obsessed with all things Patek Philippe. Of course, collectability is only focused on one brand only. But why is that from your perspective? I've been asked that question, but I want to hear your perspective. Why only Patek Philippe?
I said at the time when I was working at Patek, and I had some period where I wasn't working for Patek, I was working at Christie's and another watch brand. Without exception, I missed Patek then, and it's because every single day I learned something new about Patek. And I've been working with the brand now for over 30 years, and I can put my hand on my heart and say it's rare a day goes by that I don't learn something new. And there's very few things in life you can say that about. You will never know everything about Patek. It's
every
just
day
not possible.
I'm just humbled by scholarship, other collectors I'm learning from constantly. There's so many resources today to learn more, and it's deeply humbling. A few years ago, I felt like I really had a good grasp on all things Patek Philippe. I have so much more to learn. And one of the fun things we do with Collectability is we share what we're learning, because every day there's something new, and we want to share that with our listeners, our viewers, our clients, and that's one of the most enjoyable parts of what we do.
Without question, it is. And we'll probably talk about that a little bit later. But tell me, what was your first introduction to Patek?
It was at Sotheby's, of course. But coming back to the Graves Supercomplication, it was in researching that watch and diving deep into understanding this one incredible timepiece that I knew I was in love. It's just the ultimate intersection of art, science, horology, history. I'm paraphrasing our friend Nick Manousis and what he said in the movie Keeper of Time, of just how important horology is and why we're literally addicted to what we love.
Exactly, because it's such an integral part of our lives, and it has been forever. Mastering time is something that human beings are obsessed with.
So we both agree Patek Philippe is a bottomless pit of learning, and this is a good segue to why we do these podcasts. We have so much to share. We have so much to learn. It's a wonderful way to engage with a wider audience, and we get wonderful feedback. So thank you to our listeners.
Yes, thank you very much. It's so important to us to hear from you.
I was speaking to a friend yesterday who listens to our podcast on a daily road trip, and he it's like he's in the room listening to our conversation. And that's one of the most amazing parts about these long-form journalism, if we can call that, to share with our listeners.
For sure.
So, Tania, on this big anniversary.
Big 2-year
big
anniversary.
2 years.
Means a lot to us.
Exactly. It's very, very important. What was your favorite podcast so far?
Well, that's quite an easy one to answer in one way. It was when I interviewed my old colleague from Patek, Pamela Cloutier. I interviewed her in Geneva last November when we were there for the auctions. And I've worked with Pamela for over 30 years and known her as a dear friend for over 30 years. So it was a really easy conversation to have. I felt very honoured that we, Collectability, could share a time in Patek's history, which is the 1990s, when Philippe Stern was really at his peak of creativity and management for the company, to share what it was like to actually work shoulder to shoulder with that man, because that's how it was in those days. It was a much smaller company, and we worked directly with Philippe Stern and had the pleasure of being able to literally go into his office with an idea, and he'd say, okay, make it work. And we would go and make it work. So that's why things like the new ad campaign came out, the magazine came out, new markets were opened around the world. It was a pioneering time. It worked so well because Philippe Stern absolutely trusted who worked with him and gave them the freedom to go and make it happen. And that's a real privilege to have been part of the company at that time.
What was so incredible about that podcast that you did with Pamela Cloutier is it offered insight into the 1990s in particular, what it was like to work for Patek Philippe, how the brand was being built, the challenges that the brand was having as it was growing, the hyper-focus on product development and new concepts and ideas. And I think for many collectors today that collect so-called modern vintage, that is probably one of the only bits of public scholarship from two people that worked for Patek Philippe that's been shared publicly to date. So I was glued to every word in that podcast. And I thank you for doing it because I really enjoyed it.
Well, that was a lot of fun. It really was. And as I said before, we just wanted to share that time because it's such a pivotal time in where Patek is today. And you alluded to it then that at that time in the early 90s, even though Patek had its 150th anniversary and there was a lot of attention in 1989 for that, It was not a known brand. Very few people had heard of it. You had to be in a very privileged position to own one, as you still do today, but it was only known by those few privileged people. Philippe Stern truly understood marketing and realized how he needed to change brand awareness. And that was going to change everything for him, which it did. I mean, look at where Patek is today. It is one of arguably the best known brand, the most sought after, and that took a lot of work to make it happen. It didn't happen overnight. It took a decade of a brilliant ad campaign. You never actually own a Patek. You merely take care of it for the next generation, which is still running today, 27 years later. And just really, as you said, importantly, Philippe Stern's brilliance in creating new movements such as the small complications, the annual calendar, the travel time, pieces that opened up a whole new market segment for Patek customers. That is just a brilliant business mind working. That's why it was such a privilege for those of us who worked with him during that time to have experienced that.
It would be so amazing to have him speak with us. I don't think it'll happen, but we could dream.
We can dream. We can dream. And if not, we'll
incredible.
Talk to it would be an equal honor to talk to his son, Thierry.
That would be a dream too.
Yes.
But we'll keep trying.
We'll just keep trying. Exactly.
Now I'd like to dive right in and look at the top 10 collectability podcasts. These are the most popular podcasts that we have done. And we're going to start with number 10 and take you all the way to the number 1 podcast. Over to you, Tania.
Well, at number 10, we have Ryan Zura, who is not necessarily a household name, but he's an interesting client of ours. And we titled this podcast From Crypto to Gondolo because Ryan is a futurist. He invests in new technology. Cryptocurrency is obviously one of them. His claim to fame publicly is that he paid the most amount of money ever for an NFT piece of artwork. But he also collects Gondolo Patek Philippe timepieces. And it's a pleasure to talk to somebody who understands the future, but also respects the past.
In the number 9 position, we had Jacqueline Lee. This was a very memorable podcast for me personally because we did the interview in Miami right after the Miami Beach Antique Show. And Jacqueline is an Uber collector of the highest order. And she shared with the world some of the amazing pieces that she's acquired. She was an early client, bought a vintage Patek Philippe from Collectability. And we're a great fan of Jacqueline's. And I think Jacqueline's a great fan of ours. And she is in the number 9 spot.
Another lady I'm happy to report is at number 8, and that is Madame Evelyn Genter. Now, that was a really privileged podcast, wasn't it, John, that
Truly.
You did with Truly a Lady. Evelyn Genter was married to Gerald Genter, who we know as fans of Patek as the designer of the Nautilus wristwatch, but he's also designed the Royal Oak. And in addition to those legendary timepieces, he's had an extraordinary career of creating the most beautiful timepieces. And Madame Genter spoke very fluently about the time she's had with her husband and the extraordinary pieces that he has created in his lifetime. And that was a lovely interview.
I'm so excited to see Madame Genta back in the news with the relaunch of the brand Gerald Genta that she's doing with no other than LVMH. And this is extraordinary. History is still unfolding.
It's so exciting because she talked in her interview about how her husband was ahead of the game. He was such a genius designer. He had so many designs that we weren't ready for yet. And so that's why it's going to be so exciting to see what comes out.
In the number 7 position, Nick Falks. That was so much fun speaking to Nick. He is a huge personality. He is a genius in terms of fashion and academically and as a scholar. Of course, he's written the authorized history of Patek Philippe, so we had so much to talk about. And Nick was a dream to have on this show. And you've known Nick forever.
I have, and I was one of the editors on the official biography of Patek Philippe, and I'm sure he got quite frustrated sometimes with some of the edits that I made. That he didn't want made, but that was an extraordinary experience. It took us 2 years to edit that book.
I've seen how you edit my work. So I know how Nick feels.
And at number 6, we had the privilege of interviewing the Loop This team, who really are very close friends of yours, John. So I'm going to throw this over
that was
to you.
great. Speaking to Justin Grunberg, Eric Koo, and Sam Hines, all on the same podcast was extraordinary. We don't often hear Justin share his insight publicly, and he is, I think, one of the most influential dealers in the world. And it was extraordinary to hear his insight into the watch world. Eric Koo, a man who needs no introduction, was simply fantastic. And my former colleague and friend, Sam Hines, it was just awesome to have him on this podcast. So I encourage people to go back and listen to this one. And if you haven't gone, check out Loop This. This is something you need to see.
I agree.
In the number 5 position, another dear friend, Eric Wind. Now, here's another person that does not need an introduction. Eric was fantastic. He was one of our early guests on the show, and I think it'd be fun to bring him back again. He just gave this amazing lecture at the HSNY, and Eric is a very public figure and always has a strong opinion on all things horological.
And number 4, another great friend of yours, John, Jasm.
Oh, Jasm Al-Zarahi, Patekaholic. That was extraordinary. It was not only a very personal discussion, but a discussion about people who have passion in all things Patek Philippe, which is a trend with our podcast. But to hear Jasm's opinion, his thoughts, and how deeply he cares about all things Patek Philippe. Beautiful words were shared that day.
And then in 3rd place, we have Davide Parmigiani, arguably the world's greatest vintage watch dealer, and certainly somebody that all of us can learn from. And I remember a wonderful story about when he first started dealing in vintage wristwatches and would come over to the US, specifically here in New York, and go to 47th Street. And in those days, it was the Wild West. I mean, it's nothing like it is today. And people would literally be showing watches on the bonnets of cars on the street outside. And can you imagine what some of these watches probably were then? Really, watches, priceless watches now, but nobody knew. Nobody was dealing in vintage wristwatches then. Pocket watches were what people would buy and sell in the 80s. So he's really an entrepreneur in our industry.
In the number 2 position, Aurel Bax.
Another legend.
Another huge legend. And I remember the conversation kicked off with Aurel. How do you correctly pronounce your last name? Because everyone's like Box or Bax, as we learned is the correct way to say it. But hearing him tell the world how to pronounce his last name was really funny, really enjoyable. And this is an engaging podcast. And for our listeners, go back, listen to this one again, because he is a fountain of knowledge and offered incredible insight into the auction world.
It was a fascinating talk. Now we get to number 1.
Number 1.
I wonder if our listeners can guess who's number 1.
I know. I think we need a drum roll for this.
We do need a drum roll, yes. Are you going to say it, John?
No, over to you.
Ben Clymer.
Of course, Ben. Wow, this podcast, I'll comment on it. I had the pleasure of interviewing Ben early on in this series. He was just an open book about his history and his passage into the world of being an insider in the world of watch collecting. And I knew Ben just when he was getting started, and we kind of went back to those early years. At first, he was the outsider, but now he is the ultimate insider. And what has happened at Hodinkee and what is happening at Hodinkee is an amazing story of success.
Really, really extraordinary. And what a lovely gentleman. And I remember that podcast very well because it was the middle of the pandemic. And he was kind enough to come into New York City and meet with us in person. And I remember being very impressed by that.
Wow, that was great, Tania. Thanks for putting that list together of the top 10 collectability podcasts. And we encourage our listeners, if you have someone in mind that you think we should interview, just send us an email or a DM and we will reach out, and we would love to have more guests on the show. And it is an endless list of people that we would like to speak to, but please send your ideas to us.
Thank you. Please do. We really appreciate that.
So, Tania, why do we do these podcasts and the videos and all the articles? Why do we do this?
Well, John, it's a way of us sharing our passion and knowledge of Patek Philippe. And I know from the very, very beginning when you and I started this great journey together. And incidentally, people might not realize, but we've been talking about this for the past 20 years.
This is true, yes.
That's something that people don't know, is that ever since we first started working together in the early days at Patek Philippe, we knew we'd end up working together because we're two peas in a pod when it comes to having drunk the Kool-Aid of Patek Philippe.
True.
And we are so passionate about the scholarship behind Patek, and we are very protective of Patek. We want to share our own knowledge, and as we said earlier, we don't know everything there is to know. We can't begin to, but we will research it and learn it and share it. And I think that that's the biggest difference between us and anyone else, is that we share our knowledge. We want our clients to be really well informed when they buy a Patek Philippe, that they know exactly what they're looking at, what they're buying, what they should be looking for if they're buying a vintage timepiece, because it can be a minefield, can't it? And that really brings us to our core values. It's passion. That's what we have in bucket loads, I think. And knowledge, obviously, that's something that we work on every single day. Our client service. We were both very privileged that we worked at Patek, and we learned from Philippe Stern and then his son Thierry to be the client is the most important person and to be respectful and humble. And so we try every single day to give the best service we possibly can to our clients. And we collect data, we research, we are always on top of any new information that comes out, but we also look back. We're always researching anything we can to have as much information and data about Patek. And we look to build a community. So really what our podcasts are about and what our videos and content is sharing that information with other people and bringing other people in. So podcasts are a wonderful way for us to interview people in the community. And the videos, well, they certainly reach a much broader community, which is fun.
The videos have been so much fun. And thank you for sharing the values. Because when we started Collectability, we literally put a vision statement down and then our purpose. And I think it'd be fun to share that with our listeners. And this might be no surprise to all of you, but it's boldly on our wall in the office. The vision of Collectability is to give the ability to Patek Philippe collectors to make informed decisions on buying and selling. I mean, that's it. It's simple. But the reason we do this, the purpose of why we do this, which is also boldly written on the wall in the office, is Collectability is here to make the buying and selling of watches and collectibles simple, efficient, and stress-free. We put ourselves in our customer's shoes at every step of the way to ensure exceptional, unexpected level of service. And this is what we learned at Patek Philippe, and it's something that really needs to cross over into the vintage and pre-owned worlds. And we hope to be trailblazers.
Absolutely. Well-informed is well-armed, as the saying goes. We want to be totally transparent. We want to give everybody absolutely correct, truthful information. That's what we pride ourselves on, working at that every single day.
And it certainly keeps us busy. And this is a good segue to discuss some of the articles that you've recently written, Tania. You have really pushed the level of scholarship online with two articles in particular, one on case makers and one on movement makers. And this is a new series that you're writing. Can you share some insight into what you're doing?
I realised that, we're always constantly thinking, what can we write about? What information can we share? And it actually gets a bit overwhelming. You just don't know where to begin because there's so much. And I realised that when we're looking at watches, we see these little keys with numbers in or hammerheads with a number. And then we've got to go and look up who the case maker was. Because we deal with vintage, this is before Patek began to make its own cases. So Patek worked with many, many, many case makers for decades. And we want to share that information because it's absolutely fascinating, some of these case makers. And some of them are more important than others. And some of them worked truly hand in hand with Patek in designing watches, the look of watches, and specifically the movement makers. We've all heard of Lemania, the legendary chronograph makers, but there are other movement makers as well that were very, very important in some of the most historic and iconic Patek Philippe watches ever made. So it's sharing that information.
In your article, some of the feedback I've received, collectors have really enjoyed knowing that the Calatrava that they bought that cost $8,000 has the same case maker as a $5 million $24.99. And it's so interesting to look at things from a casemaker perspective, whether it's a Vichet or a Wenger, or the list goes on. And I'm seeing more people collect verticals, not by complication or by style, but by the actual casemakers. It's a very interesting way to collect because you get to have insight into design that you might not have otherwise.
Well, that's absolutely true. It's a completely different approach to collecting. And as you said, it's becoming a new area of scholarship, a new area of collecting, which is fascinating because these casemakers were extraordinary artists. And it just goes to show that the Calatrava and the 2499 or 1518, the similarities between casemakers is because Patek has always wanted and still today only uses the finest levels of production.
Tania, I'm often asked, John, what's your typical day like at Collectability? I've answered it before publicly. What I want to know is, what is your typical day like? So Tania, over to you.
Well, I think like a lot of people, there's no such thing as a typical day.
Yes.
I wish there was in some ways, but also I'm very glad that there isn't because it makes every day different. And a lot of my time is focused on content and sharing information. So that's always fun, talking with you about what we should do. I mean, like last week you said, I think we should talk more about the Star of Caracas, the beautiful jeweled timepiece that we have. Now, normally we wouldn't just talk about a watch, particularly a lady's jeweled watch, but there's such a great story there. And yes, quickly send that out. And I just love looking for more information that I might not know about and learning. And I fall down these rabbit holes, which, John, you can attest to.
True.
And once we start researching, we get lost because there is so much to learn. So it's really trying to share information, make sure that we're keeping an eye on the market. I work with clients as well, which is a great privilege. I love working with clients. I love looking at their collections and where possible, giving advice. So that's a real privilege because working with people is always the best part. I think something that's very important to us is understanding the market and making sure that we are up to date and can give our clients the best advice possible.
And I think your superpower, and you're hearing it first, is when you look at a watch and you're discussing with a client, because I've heard these conversations many times before, is you truly understand the past, present, and future of every single Patek Philippe. And you could put it in a historic context, even something that's made today, especially something that's made 50 years ago or 100 years ago. And your wording, whether it's written or verbal, encapsulates what truly makes a Patek Philippe a Patek Philippe. I think you, in a way, kind of hold the spirit of what the brand is all about. And for collectors that are fortunate enough to speak with you, they take that away from every conversation.
Well, that's very kind of you to say. Thank you. I guess it helps having been doing this for quite a long time now. Over 30 years, you can learn quite a lot. Shows how old I am.
We'll see what happens the next 30 years. I was just thinking, Tania, when you started at Patek Philippe, there wasn't much pop culture or celebrity engagement with the brand. In fact, if you wanted one, you needed to get in line with everyone else. Things have changed with the developing secondary market where we're seeing, it's one of the reasons we see such extraordinary price points, but we're seeing more mainstream acceptance of Patek Philippe from the world of music, sports, even television. I'm just curious what you've seen over the last 30 years in the development of Patek Philippe as a brand in pop culture.
Well, that's such a fascinating question, John. And I remember when I first started working with Patek and, our goal was to try and make it somewhat known as a brand. I mean, never mind celebrity, nothing. That was pie in the sky. But then celebrity culture was not something that Patek was necessarily going after because it felt very strongly that it was in a league of its own and didn't need a celebrity to endorse it. Obviously, that's changed today because it's become such a household name and it's in songs. We see uber famous people wearing Pateks and they get photographed because they're wearing one. I mean, when I started, we couldn't have dreamt of something like that. And funnily enough, I remember we knew we were starting to make it when I got a call from The Sopranos asking if we would lend a Patek Philippe for an episode. And at the time, Sopranos was the new show that everybody was watching, but it was a very controversial show. I mean, it's about, for want of a better word, the mafia. So it wasn't necessarily a show that we felt would be appropriate for Patek to be on. And then I said, well, look, we don't lend out watches unless we can see the context of it, because we've got to be careful. We're protecting our brand here. And they said, we never share scripts, ever. It's a closed set. And I said, well, then we can't lend you a watch. And then I get this second call. And Brad Gray, who was the director-producer, said, I want this Patek. And so they had to give a page of the text from that particular scene so that I could see how the watch was being used. And I know that was a privilege, but I didn't see it as a privilege. I just saw it as, okay, all right, well, that seems all right then. Yes, okay, well, we'll lend it then.
If memory serves me right, that was a diamond bezel annual calendar.
Correct.
Reference 5037, line 1.
Correct. That's amazing you remember that, yes.
Which I was just shocked, well, to see a Patek Philippe on The Sopranos.
Right.
But to see that reference in particular, why that watch?
Because the producer was a huge fan of Patek and specifically wanted that watch. It was very interesting, actually, that was the first time that we'd had this mix with culture, with entertainment, and that we could see there was a sea change happening, that there was this much broader audience understanding that Patek was in a league of its own. That, for me, was one of the starts, and now look at today.
Fast forward to today, and I just binge watched Succession, so I'm up to date. But the first episode of Succession, I remember I called you. I was like, I can't believe there's a Patek Philippe that is a core piece in the storyline that's given to Logan Roy in the first episode by the helicopter. And the Patek Philippe box was out. They presented the watch. I mean, I don't think they asked permission to do that. And I know everyone at HBO is listening to this podcast. I challenged them with this question. It was a fake Patek Philippe used in that episode.
Was it really?
Which is unacceptable.
Oh my goodness. Then
and
obviously
collectability is available for horological consulting for accuracy on these series, just saying. But point being is it's such pop culture from the music world and the celebrity world. We don't share this publicly, well, names. We work with some very influential people, to say the least, in curating their collections. And it's just so wonderful to see such a wider engagement and obsession with all things Patek Philippe.
Well, I think you summed it up beautifully. And I wish we could share names, but we can't. But we can say that the marketplace has changed dramatically since we started in the business. And it is a great pleasure to see younger people getting really interested in the brand, really understanding it, really researching it. And we're in a different world now. There's a new wealth out there that can afford to buy Patek, which wasn't the case 10 years ago.
This is John Reardon.
And Tania Edwards.
And you're listening to Collectability. So let's talk about the market specifically. I mean, we're seeing trends in taste, modern and vintage. We're seeing a rise of new segments of buyers. What have you seen in the last 2 years that has interested you?
Well, I think the most important thing, to be honest with you, is that at last, men are realizing that size does not matter quite as much as it used to do. And with that, I'm referring to the millimeter dimension of a wristwatch. And that's music to our ears because vintage watches are obviously smaller, and they are smaller not because men were necessarily smaller 50, 100 years ago, but because that was just the trend. And this new appreciation of a smaller size wristwatch, it doesn't need to be a huge 42 millimeter plate, and bigger is no longer better. And I love the fact that women's Patek Philippe pieces are beginning to be better understood and getting attention. And I think many of our listeners will be aware that there's been a couple of pictures in the press with Bad Bunny embracing his feminine side and wearing a couple of really beautiful diamond Patek Philippe timepieces. And that's just super cool. I love it. I mean, we couldn't have dreamt of that
Seeing
before.
A diamond bezel ellipse made for a woman originally on a man's wrist today.
From the 1990s,
It's
yes.
just shocking.
It's shocking, but he gets away with it.
Yeah.
And it looked great on him.
And the thought that 1990s is kind of an old watch is shocking to me, but I'm coming to accept that. So. But it's incredible. We're starting to hear collectors, male and female, say, I want something 33 to 34 millimeters. And this I've never heard before. And it's becoming so common over the last weeks and months.
It's wonderful, wonderful, because it opens up a limitless number of Patek Philippe's, a limitless number of price points, and it gives so much more opportunity for people to get into the brand and start owning something by Patek Philippe.
And we've watched the brands fumble over the past, we'll say, generations in presenting women with extraordinary timepieces. There's been a lot of attention to design, not so much attention to the technical. We've seen that change in recent years, but that was the storyline I embraced. But now when I go back and I'm starting to study some of these more important ladies' watches from the past, the attention to the technical, to the calibers, to the movement, to the finish, talking mechanical in particular, it's equal to the men's watches. And if anything, I could easily make the argument that the attention to detail with the cases or the bracelets was much greater for women than it was for men.
Well, that's absolutely true. And we know that some of the very first early wristwatches were actually made for women. The first minute repeater wristwatch, the first known wristwatch, Swiss-made wristwatch, was made for a woman. And we cannot forget that, because it means that women have always been important in the historical growth of Patek Philippe and how it designs its watches. I know that Patek often gets some criticism that it doesn't really have a classic female timepiece, such as the Tank Français from Cartier, but it does. It really does. It just happens to have more than one. I remember when the 24 came out, for example, and that was another exciting time again in the 90s when Patek specifically went out and found a designer who understood women, who understood women's jewelry. And they obviously briefed the designer to maintain the DNA of Patek, hence the Gondolo rectangular collection was the inspiration for the 24. But it was designed by an Italian, and they went outside to get that perfect design. And the rest is history. So they do understand how important ladies' watches are.
And that is the best-selling Patek Philippe reference
of all time.
In history.
In history. Remains today the number one
reference
seller.
4910 10A. So, but now I'm starting to see like a new generation of, and I'm saying men. I actually know some men that wear the 24, mostly women, and they absolutely love this watch, but they look at it as a vintage watch. I say in quotes.
Yes, yes.
Tania, let's talk about the May Geneva auctions.
So exciting.
Right around the corner, we're going to see some records break. We're going to see new trends, and the world will come together in Geneva to discuss all things horological with a particular vintage slant. So I'm curious, you look through the catalogs. What are your favorites from the season?
Oh, my goodness, there's so many beauties. But one for me personally stands out night and day, and that's the reference 1252, which is in Antiquorum's auction, and it is the most extraordinary Patek Philippe ladies bracelet watch I have ever seen. Well, it's a bit of a lie. I have seen it before. I've seen it in the museum. That's the only other known one. And it is in the shape of a chameleon. And it's literally a solid gold chameleon that wraps around the wrist, so like a lizard. And its tail swirls round on the one side of the bangle that opens up so you can slot it on your wrist really easily. It is beyond a work of art. It is the most magnificent, beautiful thing you can possibly see. And it comes back to what we were talking about earlier, that Patek has always been innovative with ladies' watches. And here is a design that no one's ever seen before, unless you've seen it in the museum.
Of course. And every time I ask someone that went to the Patek Philippe Museum, what was your favorite piece? They always talk about the lizard watch.
The lizard watch.
It's a chameleon, but it's the lizard watch.
It's the lizard watch, yes. And it's because they've never seen anything like it.
Yes.
That's what's so mind-blowing. And here is one up for sale.
I can't wait to go over there and
my
try
goodness.
that watch on Antiquorum. I don't think it'll fit my wrist, but I just want to feel the weight.
The weight of it. I'm sure it's heavy, yes.
And to look literally into
the eye.
The eyes.
In the eyes of the lizard, yes.
It's just such a wonderful
Oh, my
piece.
goodness. We hear this often with our clients, don't we, John? That they always have it like a holy grail, and they'll say, I would sell every single Patek I own to own that one.
Yes.
And
I hear
this
that
is
all the time.
All the time. And this is one of the ones where you'll hear me say, I'd sell all my Pateks just to own that one. I just want to wear it and love it and look at it and get so much joy out of seeing it, even though I think it'd be quite big on the wrist, but it's an experience.
And it's interesting, that watch, or that design, the 1252, was used for Henry Stern watch agency ads in the 1940s. So we've seen images of this watch from the past, but we only know of two that exist now.
And I wonder what people thought of it in the 1940s. They probably thought, oh my goodness, this is a bit weird.
Yeah, it would have been really...
It would have been so avant-garde. Think about it. It would have
Exactly.
been just odd. But today, it's magnificent. So what about you, John? What's captured your eye this season?
I have so many favorites at Antiquorum, Sotheby's, Christie's, and Phillips, but there's one piece that I think will be the ultimate watch of the season, and that is clearly the Phillips sale of the reference 96 QL, and this is the so-called Last Emperor watch. I mean, this is a platinum, previously unknown, triple date that has an incredible history. And I admit, I still want to learn more about this history because the claim is it is the last emperor's watch. I want to dig deep.
Amazing history.
And I want to know for sure, was this his watch? Because I think the provenance will just add exponential value to this piece. But forget about the last emperor. The watch itself is incredible. And
Talk about a tropical dial.
Exactly. I mean, it's a two-tone dial, which is fantastic. And the two-tone is actually described on the extract of the watch. It has what we call a roulette dial style in salmon on a silver dial. And the watch is just aged beautifully. The estimate is interesting because you rarely see an estimate like this in a catalog. Sometimes you see estimate upon request. Typically, you see a range. Their estimate is simply in excess of $3 million.
Wow.
So that's gutsy. But
Very
I think,
gutsy. Do you think this is a new thing for auction?
It could be.
How exciting is that?
I don't want to go on the record of what I think this piece will bring, but it certainly will be in excess of $3 million. It's going to be a record.
Well, that's going to be a packed house, as it always is at the Phillips auction.
Yes.
There are always a huge number of people going to Phillips. But this will be exceptional. And it's great to see Phillips with an important vintage timepiece.
Yes. And they have been finding some great watches recently. And this one, I think, will capture the news cycle of the May Geneva sales.
Well, we can't wait, John. Let's see what your predictions are.
We'll see. Now, when we speak with clients, especially when we're on the phones or we're having dinner, we love to share some of the stories from our past about watches and some of the horological adventures we've had. Some of them are just plain hilarious. You can't make them up. Some of them we can't share publicly. But
I
Tania,
wish we could share those stories. They're the best ones, of course.
Those are the best. We'll save that for a book someday.
Yeah, you have to write the book, John.
But Tania, tell me some great stories about collectors or Patek Philippe owners that come to mind.
Well, I can remember when I was at Patek, somebody from the service department bringing a watch for me to look at because they just didn't know what to do with it. And it was a La Flamme reference 4816, meaning a lady's gold and diamond bracelet watch. And it had found itself in a very precarious situation. It was part of a divorce settlement. And so the lady, the ex-wife, got the watch in the settlement, but the husband was so angry that she got this in the settlement that he had a watchmaker open it up and fill the movement with super glue, close it up again, and then she got it. And then, of course, it didn't work. And so she sent it in to us to fix. She didn't know it was full of super glue. And then it's opened up and the whole movement is completely ruined.
Brutal.
So that's why the service department came to me, what do we say to this lady? Because she's going to find out that somebody brutally ruined this timepiece. I mean, fortunately, it could be mended, a whole new movement could be put in, but obviously that's extremely expensive. So the jilted husband did a good job at causing pain all around. I just thought that was you can't make, that's one of the, can't make it up.
Nope, you
but
can't.
We've seen that.
Goodness, that's so horrifying. And we've seen, sadly, some Patek Philippe's destroyed beyond repair.
Which is heartbreaking.
It's very sad.
But we did have I remember we had a Patek that was in 911.
I remember that.
Do you remember that?
I think it was a 3919.
That's right. And it was in a vault and it was found unbelievably.
And completely melted.
Oh, it was so heartbreaking to see it, because then you just saw that even though it was obviously in a vault, the temperature had got so hot. But
And I remember what the client said. He said he wanted to pay the money to restore it. And I think actually Patek Philippe did something special for him.
That's right.
Because this was the only thing that he can do to make things right again.
Right.
It was just a small, little bit of sand of how he could, let's just make the world right again.
It was so emotional.
It was pure emotion.
And holding that watch and seeing the dial completely black was so symbolic of that day that we worked in New York at the time and were very close to. So you never know what you're going to see when you're working with Patek. That's for sure.
That's true. And just from my time there, I remember our former colleague, David Jarrett, who's the head of service, he would always run over and show us, because we were two of the people most interested in vintage.
Yes.
When there was a great vintage piece. And we saw everything, travel times, world times, 1518s, 2499s. Most of these are pieces that have not been shared publicly because they remain in the families and will stay in the families. And it's only because we had the privilege of working kind of behind the curtain that we're able to see these pieces.
Well, that's right. I remember Philippe Stern saying to me 20 years ago, 30 years ago, maybe even, some of the most important timepieces ever made have not yet been seen.
Yes.
Because they are in vaults and security boxes and drawers, mostly here in America, because the American market has been so important for Patek since the 1850s.
I could just imagine the folks working at the archives in Geneva getting the pictures. Every day they're getting hundreds of pictures of watches that have not been seen publicly.
So, John, I just told this crazy superglue story. What about you? Tell me, what's a memorable moment, a crazy memorable moment?
There's so many stories I'd love to share, but one for me, just really, I will never forget. And that is a Packard wristwatch showed up on eBay. This was a watch that was a cushion-shaped wristwatch that was made especially, the watch said it, for James Ward Packard.
Amazing.
Packard Automobiles. And on eBay, of all places.
Wow.
And all of the dealers were on it. This is going back 15 years. All the dealers were bidding on it. I recall all the dealers were trying to ring it, like, okay, let's all try to get this for a couple $1,000s. I think it started at like $500.
Wow.
But they had a secret bidder they didn't know about, and that was the Patek Philippe Museum bidding on eBay.
Wow.
And that's kind of cool.
That's super cool.
Now, the watch was clearly correct. I mean, everyone who saw it, I remember it just like, oh, this watch is right as rain. And the bidding was very spirited, and I think it was $10,000, and there was maybe a minute left, and it ended up bringing, I'm really testing my memory, maybe $30,000, maybe $35,000 at the end of the day. And indeed, Patek Philippe won the watch. And I was tasked with going to pick it up in upstate New York from the seller. Now, it was in the middle of winter. And for those of you that know what lake effect snow is, it means 5 or 6 feet of snow on the ground.
Oh my goodness.
And I flew to Buffalo and then had to drive hours. I didn't know there was a place so far away in New York to go. And New York's a big place. And I just remember driving through these backcountry roads where the snow was significantly higher than the car. And then I went down this, I wouldn't even call it a driveway. This is farmland in the middle of absolutely nowhere, to a trailer. And it was no doorbell, it was a trailer. I had to knock on the door of the trailer, and it opened up, and I went in and met the sellers who were selling this extraordinary watch. And they were very, very happy to sell it because this is a significant sum of money.
A life-changing sum of money, yes.
And wow, I was there all afternoon. We had so much fun. This is the great thing. We meet so many great people.
So many great people. But how did they get their hands on this timepiece?
They were selling it. It was basically consigned to them. They had an eBay account. They were selling widgets and such. And a friend said, "Oh, I have this old watch. Can you
wow,
can you put
I'd love to know how the friend got the old watch.
I think we know. And the watch was handed over to me, and it took another 6 hours to get it back to Rock Center. Now, every time I go to the Patek Philippe Museum, I look at the Packard display and pay homage to the watch. And
wow,
I know
that's a great story.
It's just such a beautiful piece.
Wow. You see, you never know what you're going to find. That's why we love the treasure hunt.
It's all about the treasure hunt. Tania, as we wrap up this podcast, I know you have so many stories to tell, but do you have any other memorable Patek Philippe moments that you'd like to share?
Well, I think probably the most personally important one for me was 27 years ago in Geneva. We had a number of ad agencies pitch to present a new ad campaign for Patek Philippe. And that had come about because I kept complaining to Philippe Stern that the ads were awful, and he eventually said, "Well, if you think you can do better, Madame Edwards, go and do it." So I said, "Okay, I will then." And we had, I think there was about 5 agencies pitching at the end. And I was sitting next to Philippe Stern in the Ligas Delaney presentation, and they put up this campaign, and the tagline was, "You never actually own a Patek, you merely look after it for the next generation." And my immediate response was that my eyes filled up with tears. It was an emotional reaction I had. And I thought, this is it. This is everything in one line. And as I said, I was sitting next to Philippe Stern, who simply said, "Très bon." And we knew it was a winner. And that was it.
And that's where it all started.
And that's where it all started. So
what happened in that room, like literally changed the course of Patek Philippe history and its acceptance in the world.
It really did. And I think that we cannot underestimate the power of advertising. We cannot underestimate the power of a genius, brilliant line that sums up what a brand is all about.
Now, are there different versions of that tagline for the British and the American market?
There was a slight alteration. I wanted it to say "take care of." And the British ad agency wanted to say "look after it," because I thought that "take care" was more powerful than "look after." And so the compromise was that in the US, the ads say you merely take care of it for the next generation. And in every other country in the world, it says you look after it for the next generation. So there's a little bit of an insider reveal
really good.
as to the slightly different wording that happened. But I think now that I'm not there, they probably have compromised and used one. So, John, I mean, it's been so wonderful to sit and talk with you today.
This has been a lot of fun.
We don't normally get a chance to just gas like this, so I hope our lovely listeners have enjoyed it as much as we have. But what are your parting thoughts for today?
I just want to thank our listeners, our friends, our clients, and the engagement that we have day to day within the collectability community is incredible. And I think about, I have one particular client, and I know you're listening. He prefers to call and discuss watches with me when he's in the bathtub. Yeah, you know who he is.
I know who he is because he's done the same with me.
Yes, I mean, but
how do you respond to someone saying, "Oh, I'm in my bath talking to you now"?
It's like, is that water I hear in the background? But you get used to it after a while.
Oh, dear.
I have other friends and clients that one in particular sends me a horological joke day after day. I check my WhatsApp and he's in Asia, so it just cracks me up to start each day. I could count on there's a watch or a clock joke to.
I love it. I love that there's so many.
And most of them I can't share on this podcast. It's just the people are at the core of this. And every day we're meeting new people, hearing stories, learning about their watches. Many of these watches aren't for sale. We're just helping people understand their family's heirlooms. And that, to me, is what collectability is all about.
We're very, very privileged, John. We really are.
Tania, thank you so much for your time today. You helped create collectability from day one. The core values of this company you embody: passion, knowledge, clients, data, community. This is what you do. And you set the bar high for all of us here in the collecting world.
Thank you, John. It's such an honor, truly, to work with you. And it's a dream come true for me that we can do this today. We're very lucky.
We're very, very lucky. And it's still just the beginning. Thank you so much to our listeners for joining us today. If you listen to this episode, please like and subscribe so that you do not miss any future episodes. This is John Reardon
and Tania Edwards
for Collectability.